Saturday. Welcome to Live. I am so excited to have Dr. Ianessa Humpert here. The reason why I asked her to come on to the show is because, Dr. Humpert, you really did have such a year in 2022 with our professional organization. And I really just admire you for not allowing that to stop you from your passions outside of, not necessarily outside of speech pathology, but outside of what the norm is. So I really just appreciate you just kind of paving the way for us, especially as women of color. So I have her here because Women's History Month is coming up. And she is definitely making history. And again, I feel that we can all look up to her in a lot of ways when it comes to just fighting against the odds and oppositions in our field. Dr. Humper, as you definitely know, it is hard to be a Black speech pathologist in the field or even in graduate school. It's very difficult. We deal a lot with microaggressions, white supremacy, and it's really hard to just stay motivated as that. I've dealt a lot with that this year myself. So thank you for coming on to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And happy Women's History Month and Black History Month.
Oh, yes. Oh,
We're
yes.
almost in between both of them, aren't we?
Yes, we are. I love that we're on the cusp. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot to celebrate. There's definitely a lot to celebrate. So I will go ahead and give you the mic. If you could just tell us about yourself, your background, and why you joined the field.
Sure. So my name is Ianessa Humbert. When I started, I was Ianessa Johnson because I was not married. I'm not married again. But I am probably known most for my last name, Humbert, through research, etc. So I decided to become a speech pathologist partly because I was a French major in undergrad and I'm Canadian, so it was kind of just easy. And my Jamaican parents were like, I'm sorry, what, what job is that? That's not a job. So I asked my sister what she thought I would be good at. And she goes, all I know is that you need to figure out how to make money correcting people's speech because that's all you do anyway for free. So, like, if there's a job for that, go for it. So I went to the counselor's office, like I was a junior, and I asked them what job exists where that's the case. I'd never heard of speech pathology before, and that's how they direct me to it. So I always find it really interesting that people say, I always knew I wanted to be a speech pathologist. Like now on faculty, I'm no longer on faculty, but when I was at universities and looking at admissions essays, and I would see people have this story about speech pathologists and how their mom is one or they have an aunt who is one, I'd be like, I have never heard. I'd never heard of that field before. And I still spend time explaining it to people. 20 something years later, I got my master's completed in 2000. So it's been over 20 years, and I still find myself explaining what this field is to people.
Yeah, we'll probably have to keep explaining what this field is to people
Yeah,
until it gets
yeah,
so big as MDs.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then after I got my master's, I did my master's at Howard University, and my PhD was somewhere between Howard University and the NIH. I did all my dissertation work at the NIH, and then NIH National Institutes of Health for people who don't know. Then I did my postdoctoral fellowship at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Then I was on faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where I went from assistant to associate professor. And then I was recruited to University of Florida and then University of Iowa. And then I retired 2 years ago.
Wow. Well, first of all,
Yeah.
congratulations. You definitely did your thing in the field. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And you're touching all different coasts too. So what an impact that you most likely made on the women and the men who you were instructing at that time.
Um, what impact do you think I made on the students?
No, no, I
Oh,
was saying that you did
oh,
make
okay.
an impact. Yeah, but I'm sorry, that was a definitive statement for
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
So what experiences influenced your decision to leave academia and pursue research outside of an ASHA membership?
I don't pursue research outside of ASHA membership. When I
Okay.
retired from academia, I mean, that's what I did on faculty. I primarily researched, and I also taught, and I also gave talks, all around the world and everything. But when I was my primary job was being a scientist, and when I retired, that's primarily what I retired from. I even sent back 2 NIH grants. I was just like, I don't want part of this world anymore. So Um, I left and I took 2 years off to do whatever the heck I wanted to. I didn't care what it was. I was going to do any other thing I felt like doing.
Well, tell us about those 2 years. I wanna hear about that.
I did, well, it was 2000 to 2022, and, we're just at the beginning of 2023.
Okay.
But I was very intentional about just finding something else that felt good. And what felt good was not really having any particular direction. I mean, I did a lot in a short time. And even before I went to college, I, always had like a couple of jobs and just doing a lot of stuff. So I was grateful to not do anything for 2 years. I would recommend it to anyone who has the capacity to do it.
Mhm.
And the reason is that you realize you're being led forward by the timeline set before you by an institution who doesn't know you. These institutions know what they need for their bottom line, and they say, can you fit in this particular shape that we require? And as long as you do, you're often allowed to stay. And if you don't, you're not. And then you tied so much of your worldview, your life, your identity to these positions at these institutions. And if anything happens to you, they replace you so quickly, your head would
Mhm.
spin. And at the end of the day, you're wondering, well, who was I outside of this job? What kind of life could I have lived? And fortunately, I was able to support myself financially, right? Because I was smart about those kinds of things. So when the time came to leave, I could really enjoy 2 years of traveling, of doing all kinds of art projects that I've ever wanted to do, just socializing with friends I hadn't seen for a while, sitting and thinking about something that I derive, not something that is derived by a job of some sort or an outside need that's impinging upon my time and my thinking space,
Mhm.
and getting to know who I am outside of those rigors.
Oh goodness. Wow. You were preaching a lot because I think a lot of us are feeling the burnout. And
Mm-hmm.
um, from my experience, I would say that a lot of the burnout does come just like what you said of giving our time and energy to someone else's mission and so, fitting into a box, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's amazing that you use that time to just do you feel like you found yourself? Let me not put words in your mouth. Do you feel like you found yourself during that time or found out hobbies that you didn't know that you had within you?
So I think there are a lot of versions of myself, and I found the purest version of myself. The version of myself that I lived before was one that was a lot of what I wanted to do, but also under the constraints of things that I needed to do. Now, mind you, I had two younger sons. I was married. I had several doctoral students who were training under me. I had several employees and staff members and helping to run the lab. I was committed to giving all these talks all over the place. I was on committees. I was teaching, auditoriums of students.
Yeah.
Um, and that is a part of me. I signed up for it. I enjoyed it. I wanted to be an expert, and I did it. But when I noticed that the returns felt like they were diminishing and I couldn't find pleasure in it at the same rate as when I started, or when it seemed like continuing wouldn't give me any more joy because the steps beyond, once you get to like, you do things you like associate, then full professor, and then it's like department chair, dean, provost. I was not interested in any of those administrative positions. And that's what people were recruiting me for dean, for department chair, for all these other things. I'm not interested in the upper echelons of academia. And that's because it's messy and people, they act like there's a lot of integrity there, but actually, I just wish they would admit that it's mostly about money. Money and
Mhm.
prestige and money and prestige. And to the extent that somebody fits in something that's the goal oriented for them, they care about it, even if it's wrong. And they won't say that. They hide behind this veil of this is academia. We have integrity. You should take our word for it. We're ethical. We're in the ivory tower. But actually, that's not true. And
Mhm.
so the more I saw that, the more I was like, I want nothing to do with it. And I'm grateful that I left when I could because COVID made a lot of people's jobs very difficult and uninteresting. And the passion started to really go down. And I got out just before that happened. So
Yeah.
now the version of myself that I interact with now is the one that is dependent on what I decide I want in life and not dependent on what external factors tell me are worthy to pursue.
Mhm. Wow. That is huge, especially when we talk about just kind of scaling up and going to the dean level and everything, and that seems like the track-mindedness,
Hmm.
and yeah, so shout out to you for staying authentic with yourself, like, I know it sounds good, but I know that that's not something I actually want to do with my life. It's too short. Life is too
Hmm.
short. So what have been your greatest challenges as a researcher, both positive and negative?
Hmm. The greatest challenges as a researcher is always trying to do the research and not all the other stuff that comes with it. It's the same thing as being a speech pathologist. You go into speech pathology not because you're like, I cannot wait to write goals. I cannot wait to put in billing codes. I cannot
Right.
wait to have a conversation with the rehab director who doesn't give a crap about me. Like, that's not what you go there for, but that's a lot of what you're doing, right? And
Right.
the same thing with research. I loved being in the lab and experimenting. I love creating questions and being able to answer them, looking at the data and talking about people about it, and then putting slides together to talk to people about it, and going to listen to other people's talk and asking questions and getting really to the nitty gritty of whether or not somebody's claims are valid. That
Mhm,
excited me. Um, and the problem, I think, with research is that it is a money driven phenomenon or industry just like anything else. So the people who have the most prestige or power in universities, if you're faculty, tend to be the ones with the most money. And by that I mean grant money or some kind of money to pursue your research, which means you buy out your time from things like teaching and service. And that means that you then are allowed to do what you want a little bit more, right? And
mhm,
you're not sort of tied down by student questions, etc. But it also means that there are other important exploits that you don't get to do. So for instance, I got a lot of, you know, bonuses for publishing papers in journals that no speech pathologist is ever going to read about the intricacies of the white matter connections in the brain when somebody's doing a swallowing task. Frankly, that's all fine and dandy. And there's a bunch of people like, oh my God, you published in an X journal. It's so prestigious. And it's never going to change anyone's life, probably ever. I mean, look, it could be that, oh my God, that's the paper that was so pivotal that changed dysphagia management. I won't be here to see it. So let's just
mhm.
hope I'm wrong. But I'm
Yeah,
probably right that research and the role of an academician is that we don't focus a lot on what is needed right now. What's needed is for our students to have a very rigorous instructor who cares about them, but we're not incentivized to do that. We are
yeah.
not incentivized to do that. The other thing that is needed is that my research holds hands with the clinical questions, but we're not incentivized to do that. In fact, if I submitted a grant to the NIH that would literally ensure that we know whether what clinicians are doing in their institutions works, I would have to be very clever about how I get around the fact that they don't want to fund that kind of stuff. They do not
Mhm,
want to fund studies to see if what we're already doing works. They only want to fund new, interesting, innovative things, even if that thing has much less merit in terms of helping a patient in the next year than this device that could possibly one day do something in 20 years. For speech pathology and swallowing in particular, that's a downer because we started doing practices before we knew if they would work. We didn't do the research and say, oh, the research is suggesting we should do this. So now we're doing a bunch of research to show that what everybody's doing should or should not have ever been done in the first place. Now you're trying to go back and change people's minds about something that was never ever the case in the first place. You know, anyone can come with any claim, and now people are doing it. Now you're like, wait a minute, no one ever said that worked. You know,
yeah,
it's so much harder to change minds 20 years after people have been doing it than before
mhm.
they started in the first place. And that's what the other bummer is about research, is that you're not incentivized to answer those questions, and you put all your power and financial prowess behind it.
Yeah, that is very, disheartening because I'm sure that as you are going and doing those projects or even applying for grants and you like
Mm-hmm.
you said, you had to be very clever, very creative. Okay, how can I get money from this, basically?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and as I'm hearing you and putting myself in your shoes, I'm thinking, eek, my stomach would almost hurt doing some of those because in the back of your mind, you're like, there's some ethics behind this too, and I have to figure out how to do this ethically. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, more power to you. I don't think that that's something, I also appreciate that you call yourself a scientist too, because as speech pathologists, I don't think that we feel empowered enough to say that, even though a lot of us are researchers. So,
What do you mean?
so I don't see a lot of speech pathologists calling themselves scientists, like the ones who are mainly in research.
So you mean people with PhDs who are actually doing research?
Yeah, people with PhDs who are actually
I
doing
think that
research and
scientists
people
and
not doing it.
researchers are used pretty interchangeably, but the
Okay.
more you go into the world of medical science, then we refer to ourselves more as scientists. Sometimes social scientists don't say it as much, and everybody's research is as equally valid as others. I think it's just sort of a term preference. One isn't better or worse than the other. Some people
Mhm.
call me researcher, that's fine. Some people call me a scientist, that's fine.
Thank you for clearing that up
Yeah, no
too.
problem.
Thank you for clearing that up.
It's
I
sort
do
of
like
like
that.
you might hear physician, you might hear doctor, you might hear clinician. And depending on where you go, like at Hopkins, they always said physician, always said physician. I was like, okay. They're like, yeah, we don't call ourselves, like somebody said that, patients call us doctors, but we don't really call each other that. We call each other physicians. I'm like, okay, whatever.
Did they say
It's fine.
why?
I think it's just that, like, it's the same thing. Like they say physiatrist at Hopkins, another place they say physiatrist or something like that. And I was like, oh, it just really is, whatever local terms people use. Same thing with scientist and researcher. Yeah,
One of those potato things, I guess.
exactly. Dysphagia, dysphagia.
Yeah, dysphagia, dysphagia. That is still a debate. I'm trying to figure out. I
It
say
really
dysphagia.
shouldn't be. It really doesn't matter.
What do you say?
I say dysphagia because
Okay.
that is what the larger scientific community has always said. Some people say dysphagia. I started saying dysphagia, and then I went to some meetings. I think I showed up at the NIH and everybody said dysphagia. So I was like, oh,
Let
dysphagia.
me just go back to
But
dysphagia.
it's rare to hear experts say dysphagia. And in fact, if you do, sometimes they look at people like, oh my God. But it's just another layer of elitism that's dumb. Can we get over that to just fix the darn thing? Can we get rid
Right,
of it, regardless of what
right,
you call it? Can we
right.
can we minimize it for people? Can we focus on that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about STEP. So you've already made great history with the STEP community. I remember even when I was in grad school, we got to watch STEP. We had the STEP program. So can you tell us a bit about how you decided to create the program, what experiences you've had before and after you've created it since its launch?
Sure. So I was in the thick of things as in academia as a professor, and I at this point was giving a talk somewhere in the world or in the country every month. And I would get these messages from people like, "Hey, Dr. Humbert, 2 years ago when you were in Germany, you had a slide about blah blah blah." I'd be like, "I don't remember being in Germany. How about that? Much less what slide I said." So I was like, "I don't even remember. Damn, I was in Germany. Shit, that's right. Crazy." So I already had an online learning situation for critical thinking and dysphagia management, where we would take that course that we did in person and put it online. And I also had an online learning opportunity with Rinki Verandani Desai. She is the co-founder of STEP, and she and I had something called Dysphagia Grand Rounds, where we take a paper once a month and I would walk people through it, and then we could have like a guest could be one of the authors, etc. And it's currently available on Step. And I said to her, I just need a place to, like, dump all my talks, because there are so many people asking for this part of the talk and that part of the talk, and we'll just charge, at the time it was like $9 a month. It was 5 years ago. And we'll just, like, it'll just be a place where people can find the talks at a reasonable price. It's not this commitment of $300 or something. If you got $9 in a month, you got, hours and hours of content. We have like over 50 hours of content. Like, that's how many talks I was giving, right?
Wow.
So, and we created some just for Step 2. But we ended up with thousands of subscribers. Like, that's basically what retired me too. Like, it's like, are you kidding me right now? Like, I knew that there was a need, but because I
Right.
kept getting the messages, but I didn't know there was a need, right?
Mhm.
So I am really grateful for that. And so as a result, because there are so many people engaging in it, we have just been sort of building the brand out more and more. And so what we're doing next month is we have something called Step Prep, because Step focuses a little bit more on grad students, yes, but really depends on whether or not their instructor decides to use it in the course. Now, our goal is to replace the textbook because there's nothing more dynamic and relevant than seeing video fluoroscopic images with people discussing it and saying, this is what you're looking for, this is what you want to do for measurement, as opposed to seeing a line drawing in a book and hoping your instructor has access to the number of images I have. As a scientist, I had so many de-identified images of people swallowing that I had hours and hours of this stuff, and it's just sitting, in some hard drives. So I was like, well, we need to use this for education, and most instructors don't have any access to that really, unless they do MBSIMP, which is more narrow than STEP in terms of what it covers, right? It is literally about modified barium swallow studies, and we talk about a wider range of things. So
Mhm.
for that reason, we've been expanding it. And our next thing that we're going to do next month, which what I was saying, is called STEP Prep. And it focuses on grad students who want to take two of our most popular brands. One is called Snaps, which is Swallowing Neuroanatomy Physiology Shorts, where I create all the graphics for 9 or 10 major aspects of swallowing. And then Foundations, which is a little bit more clinically relevant, talks about presbyophagia, modified barium swallow studies, what is the chin tuck, and it's a little bit more in depth, how to do a CSE, a clinical swallowing evaluation. So we're going to take those two brands and have a separate option for people, for grad students, and CFs to pay for that and get a certificate, which is a little bit more difficult testing process, because they would like to put something on their CV saying that they've completed this kind of training. But right now, STEP is too big and all consuming for them to finish that in time for them to show that they've done a lot of that basic foundational work.
Okay. Okay. So you're saying that so next month you're putting out something for the
STEP prep.
yeah, step
Yeah.
prep for the graduate students.
Yeah. And it
Um,
doesn't depend on whether or not their instructor uses it in their class.
so they can use it on their own.
Yeah, and it's not like getting a membership where they pay monthly and there's no way to indicate I've done this training, because they're still at a point where they want to show the person they're trying to be employed by that this is something that's on my training schedule. I've done this, I've done MBSIMP,
Mhm.
and having a certificate about these specific areas is something that helps them to say, hey, I've done some extra training here.
That's incredible. So then in that case, how do you envision STEP in the future? Because it seems like I could just picture it 20 years down the line where it becomes even more certifications, where it empowers even more speech pathologists to be who want to go in the med settings. But
Hmm.
how do you see it down the line?
Well, we've added a couple of new things. One is that we have some in-person meetings coming up. We've never done in-person meetings through STEP. It's always been online. So I created the Swallow Physiology Masterclass to really get people who are serious about this to work in a dedicated way on critically thinking through what you're doing. We had tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 1 is normal swallowing. Tier 2 is disordered swallowing, already online. Tier 3 really is about the you versus you of being a clinician in dysphagia management, right?
Mm.
And that's an in-person meeting where we really talk through some of the biggest complaints that speech pathologists have, and we specifically tailor it to the people in that room at the time, which is why we're not accepting too many people. So moving into the in-person training is really a big key area. The other thing is to have other kinds of in-person training, similar to what I did in an in-person course I had 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, called Normal Swallowing 101. And we had about 70 speech pathologists be able to go through and look at their own video fluoroscopic images live in front of everybody and swallow various consistencies and do postures and maneuvers, etc. And the reason that was great is because a lot of them would look at their swallow and be like, oh my God, I put you on a modified diet.
Mm.
And they realize, well, I aspirated her. Everyone has a residue sometimes, or sometimes I swallow and the bolus is way down in my piriform sinuses before I initiate my swallow, and I'm normal. So why am I
Mhm.
putting people with peg tube? Why am I recommending peg tubes for people who have a swallow like mine? So it's really getting people to understand what they're doing to the bodies of other humans because they were poorly trained, and why it's not okay anymore.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That's definitely going to just change the game. Just completely change the game in our field.
That's the goal.
So, really quick with the fun stuff. So, I have been to you in Jordan, JRC, the SLP. I've been to y'all social scene.
Yes.
Can y'all tell us a little bit? Can you tell us a bit about that and how it even came about? What makes you the most excited about it? Your favorite thing about the social scenes?
Yeah. So what happened was Jordan and I had been talking about getting together because she didn't live far from me in DC for a while, and we'd been interacting online for a bit, but just never got a chance to meet in person. And so when she came by, we went down to walk down U Street because I live right on U Street, and had a drink. We just talked about the issues that we're seeing in our field, which if you just look at her page, you see what we're talking about. If you look at my page, you see what's going on. And I told her that I wanted to do something more social to get a lot of the DC based SLPs together. And I suggested we have like some kind of a party. And if we were going to have a party in November, then we would need to do something first, just a proof of concept, like in DC, which we did in August. And then in November, we had our very first SLP social scene in Washington, D.C., where there would be a lot of not only DC based SLPs, but folks from all over the country and the world. And we, at the time, didn't think for a second that it would be predominantly Black.
Mhm.
We were shocked because, the pictures and everything from the very first DC based proof of concept had a wider range of people. I think there were more white SLPs in that picture, in that marketing. And then when we had the big one in November, it was almost completely Black. And we were like, wow, oh my goodness. And I think what happened was, it's not that they were looking to see who the attendees were, they were looking to see who the organizers were. And because Jordan and I are Black, they were like, oh, this is for me. And
Yeah.
so a lot of what's also interesting is I heard that a lot of white people didn't think it was for them because we were the organizers. So it was a nice way to demonstrate what representation is in more than one direction. We never advertise it as a Black party. It's not like SLP Magic, as an example, Black SLP Magic, where it's clearly
Mm.
saying we are targeting this group. But it ended up doing that simply because, as organizers who are Black, people opted in based on saying, oh, they represent me, and opted out saying that they don't. So if anybody ever wonders why our field is so white, you kind of know what's going on. And the same way that I had no clue what an SLP was, a lot of people who did is because their mom or their aunt or their sister or their grandmother was a speech pathologist, and we're still like, what are they? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the likelihood that we're going to line up and be involved is a little lower. So I was really excited, one, that was a social event, because networking is important. As you know, getting into spaces that are new can be challenging, but getting into spaces that are new, where you have somebody who's helping you, ushering you through, holding your hand, making connections and introductions, it just makes it a bit easier. And I
Mhm.
wanted for that to be the case. And what ended up being the best thing is that all these people would come and go, I had no idea that there were this many Black SLPs. And even when we posted the stuff online, people were like, where have y'all been? Because a lot of people felt so isolated, and now they know that there are other people who might be going through things that are similar, who they can talk to.
Yes, I really think about one girl. She is in undergrad, or no, actually, she's in graduate school in New York, and she's the only Black woman in her program.
Mm.
And I just remember meeting her, and she was so excited, like so geeked to be there. She's like, oh my gosh, Ianessa, oh my gosh. She was just fangirling, but it was so amazing. It was so amazing to see. So I can just imagine what's going on in the hearts of the other undergrads, graduate students, and even practicing speech pathologists who came. I was definitely jumping for joy.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward. I'm sure y'all are going to Boston, right?
So I'm
Okay.
not sure if Jordan wants to do it the way we did. Well, I didn't. I wasn't involved in the last one because I was too tired of anything related to Ash. Like, I needed a break, obviously.
Right, yeah.
But the Black SLP Magic is going to be in New York, not during ASHA. So I wasn't sure if the goal was to do an ASHA based one or not. But Jordan and I will talk. We'll figure that out.
Okay. All right. Well, we will definitely be looking forward to those ads. I'm glad that you mentioned Asha and fatigue from that.
Mm.
So let's also get into that nitty-gritty of our conversation. You are doing work with Gulp Group. Can you tell us a bit about its mission, how it started, and your work within that organization?
Yeah, so Gulp was created because at the beginning of me being retired, I wondered if there are other interesting ways that I could use my expertise in swallowing and physiology and oral cavity and just the way the body works, and the way humans behave, to benefit other aspects of swallowing. So I went on Instagram and I typed in sexual health or sexual health expert, sexual educator, and the first person's name who popped up was Reba Thomas. And she is a DC-based sexual expert, sexual health expert, who is a CEO of a company she started called Sexpert Consultants. And upon talking, we realized that there's a lot of overlap between what we do. So, for instance, she gives the most popular fellatio workshop in DC. And in that class, there are a lot of people who their biggest complaint is that their gag reflex is getting in the way. I had no idea. First of all, I never heard of fellatio workshops. So let's start there. And number two is, I never thought that would be the thing that they'd have an issue with. But of course, after she said, I was like, that actually does kind of make sense, right?
Yeah.
And then, but she doesn't know anything about the gag reflex. In the same way, I didn't know anything about fellatio workshops, right? So that's the kind of education she needed from a physiologic standpoint, because some of the things people were doing to diminish or get rid of their gag reflex bordered a bit on potentially problematic down the road, like swallowing what you call it, topical anesthetics and that kinds of things. Doing that kind of thing regularly, anytime you numb your nerves all the time, it could be the case where some of those nerve endings don't respond the way you need them to. And as you know, your gag reflex is a protective bodily function that requires a stimulus to elicit it. And if it no longer gets a stimulus and you actually need it to protect from a foreign object, like maybe a piece of food or something or just, it could be a pill, it could be anything that's going the wrong way, or that a spoon, anything that you need to gag, and if that response doesn't happen, it's problematic. So what we were able to do was get together and talk about all kinds of things, and I was super curious about a lot of things that she does. So we called it GULP, which stands for Gaining Understanding About Lovemaking and Physiology. And we did like 4 Instagram lives on various topics. The first one was Bleck, Keep Your Gag in Check. And then we went on to all kinds of other topics. So I was going to say that what her industry, ours, as you know, is ASHA, American Speech Language Hearing Association, and hers is American Sexual Health Association, but they call it ASHA. So it's also ASHA, but totally different organization.
I like that.
One that wants you to talk about sex and one that does not.
Does not. So let's get into that. So you face blatant discrimination. I was first going to ask you, if you can tell us about your thought process when you did decide to go against the grain and talk about ASHA or speech pathology in the realm of sex.
I never thought about any grains. I almost never think about grains. I just do what I'm going to do. And if it turns out it creates friction, honestly, half the time I'm a little shocked by it. I am a free-thinking individual, a private citizen. I'm not doing it on behalf of my institution or on behalf of some church. I'm just an individual who's forming a good collegial relationship with another individual where we're talking about these issues. This was not going against a grain, other than that the people who didn't want me to talk about that had a issue with me doing it more so than the other women who had done this, who had written books about it, who happened to be white, who were specifically saying that as speech pathologist, this is why I can train you to do better oral sex, which is very different from what I was saying, which is, as a speech pathologist, if you have patients who complain about this after having a stroke or something like that, there's this profession called sexual health, or as sexual educators, who you can send these questions to. That's mostly what I was doing, but also answering any specific questions. In my head, that was almost going way more along the grain than the other books that I'd known about after I'd done this.
So what would you say that this means with the state of the field? So 2 things. For example, why do you think that ASHA had such a big problem with you doing this, going against the grain, talking about sex education, sending resources for people who needed it, and also just blatant discrimination, or what you've noticed? What do you think this means with
I
how
just
this
think that they're racist and sexist. That's it.
Yeah.
Nothing shocking, nothing. I mean, what we need to stop doing is being shocked when people show up the way we expect them to. It's just like, okay. Like, it's the being shocked that keeps us from acting, because you spend so much time reeling and, oh my God, I'm this is who they are. Until they show you different, expect what they do. when, as Maya Angelou said, when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. That was the first time for me, and I
Mhm.
will always believe them. Their capacity to make me think anything other is going to be very difficult, and they don't have any obligation to do that for me. Um, but what's really interesting is their goal was to try to strip me of a license that I wasn't even using. They pulled up my DC license that I stopped using like maybe 15 years before. It wasn't even current. And the ASHA license, I was paying for it for 8 years and I hadn't even been seeing patients. I just kept it in case, I decided, I don't know, you just know how it is. Like, I don't think I want to take the practice, so I just pay for it. I was like, y'all come get this. I don't owe you any explanation. And I never gave them one.
Mhm.
You don't deserve 5 minutes of my time to tell you what I'm doing with my private Black self.
Say that. Say that again. Well, you definitely got a whole bunch of support on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram. Um, I'm sure outside of Instagram, but the
Oh my God,
petition
yeah.
is huge. What was some of the feedback that you've gotten?
Some of the feedback that I got was that they can't believe. It was the whole shock that I cannot believe they do this. And the most important feedback I think I got was, wow, I really see what the institution is that I've been paying into. That's one. And two, the most difficult to hear is how people had submitted claims and they didn't tell me the details for liability. They go, Dr. Humbert, I can't believe this is happening. At my institution, I and two other SLPs submitted ethics complaints against our rehab manager who was trying to force us to do unethical things for billing purposes. And they told us they're not allowed to even pursue it. And you say you call yourself a swallowologist and they want you to, and they're using my ASHA money for that. You're not even hurting anybody. The number of times I heard that made me go, wow, they are just doing political stunt work here. They are not going after the actual claims that matter. They're going after the claims that they think will make them look bad instead of actually be good.
That is probably the most disheartening thing still, even though it's one of those things where, like you said, people show you who they are, believe them the first time. But I can definitely speak for the early career speechies who are painted still a picture of the field, almost
Mm-hmm.
given a fairy tale. But at the same time, I do think it's good to be on defense with that. I'm just like, look, this is a possibility of what could happen, and you can also still fight about it. You can still fight for it. So I also
Mm-hmm.
saying that you're a citizen, like you are yourself. You weren't doing that on behalf of Asha. You weren't doing that on behalf of anybody but Ianessa Humpert. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I think one thing to remember is that sometimes things happen to people because there's a larger lesson that needs to be learned. My decision to not to send it to a few close friends, to be like, you're not gonna believe this, and that's it, and them go, you have to do something like, no thanks, but if you want to, that's fine, and it turned into that. And then within 7 days of me getting it, they're taking it away because the person who submitted it was getting basically death threats from people I don't know. This is not about me, right? This is, I might be the conduit through which this happens. And forgiveness is giving up hope for a better past. I don't want a better past. I want a better future. So I'm not going to spend time trying to figure out how it could have been different. It wasn't different. And you know what? It was exactly the way it needed to be. All the
Yes.
lessons that needed to be learned, including by myself, and the directions that I need to continue to take, the fact that showing up as my purest self seemed like an act of rebellion tells me I'm on the right track.
Yes. Yes. I
It's
love
one
that.
thing, it would be one thing if I was out there trying to hurt people or hurt myself or something. But the fact that people were so offended by my Black existence in a free state where I'm not adhering to anybody else, the fact that they were utterly agitated tells me that they're the people with the problem and they're not sleeping well at night. But guess who gets 8 to 9 hours?
We love it. And it shows in your beautiful skin.
Thank you.
It shows. It
Girl,
shows.
it's that 3 p.m. tequila. Don't play.
Okay, I love it. I love it. I need a shot. I need a shot.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can, just speaking of the path that Asha is going, can you just tell us a little bit about the changes that need to be made on the side of COSD, just to make it more inclusive? What you hope
Um,
in the
I
future?
have decided that, hmm, I guess the way, so usually when I say this, it divides the room, and that's not my goal today because I actually want people to listen and not, I want people to be able to hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. And it's
Mm,
really hard for people. Both can be true. Yes, we want more numbers. Yes. Can we just say that we want more? Can everybody just believe me when I say it would be nice to have more? I will also say the number we have is sufficient to
mm,
do the work that needs to be done now. We don't need to double the numbers. What, then you guys are going to do something? Do you know that our field is 4% male and they own the most of the stuff? I actually published a paper in this in an ASHA journal in 2018 about how much they make more money. They're more likely to be tapped for PhDs and leadership positions. They're more likely to be department chair. Even if they don't have a degree in speech pathology, they're more likely to be promoted. And it's not a numbers game per se. It's really about where you position yourself and what demographic you're in and what people expect of you. People expect males to be in charge. They don't even have the numbers to vote themselves in. They get awards far beyond we do. So, fellow and honors. In 2015 or 2016, I was at ASHA doing grant reviews or something. And every year they have on the wall the people who got honors that year. That is the top award you can get from ASHA, and about 50% of them were male. And I looked at that award, at that wall, and I thought, oh wow, men had a good year this year because they're only 4% of the field. And then Margaret Rogers, who's she's in charge of research at ASH, she goes, oh no baby, women had a good year this year. This is the first time that women even got parity with men, and since the 20s. And our field is 96% female. So if you think it's a numbers game, you're wrong. The 3% has way more power to do way more than they. If we doubled it right now and went to 6, it would be better in terms of the power and clout and et cetera, that and independence that we decide we want. We do that because we take it. We don't do it because we wait for more numbers. South Africa is majority black. They just got through apartheid. They're like 7% white. So it's really not a numbers game. It's really about how you position yourself. And again, I'm not saying I don't want the numbers. Every time I say it, they'll be like, don't you think? Yes, hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. You can do it. Yes, we want the numbers. And in the meantime, which is not going to happen anytime soon because it's been 3% the whole 20 years I've been here, what am I going to do? Wait for 6?
wow.
And what would 6 do that you can't do right now?
Mm,
So all those ideas that you have that you're waiting for and using the numbers as a reason, well, they're not going to like it anyway, and do it anyway. They're not going to like it. What are you going to do? Live your life based on people who don't give a rat's ass about you? They're not even thinking about you. That's how infinitely unimportant you are in their lives. You're just a nuisance. When you think of it that way, that they only think about diversity when the issue comes up, when people are rioting, that they want to put their little black squares up and put their thing on. That's all they really care about. And it's about what they demonstrate, not what they write about. That
mhm.
said, if they can't follow their own direction and mission on their own website, you need to figure out what you're going to do for you and your website. What's your brand, baby?
Yes. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I think that so many of us needed to hear that. I'll definitely co-sign, piggyback off of you that we're strong, we're small but mighty. And, sadly, we do feel very beaten down, like I said, by the isolation and everything. But just like what we were mentioning before with social scene and how there really is so many of us, I would say and argue and say it's also about networking and building that strong
Yes.
community, not so much crabs in a barrel or just not so much
Yes.
keeping ourselves apart from each other too. That would be a great way for Black speech pathologists to move forward for sure.
Well, may I also say that people need to do that? If any group needs to do their shadow work in this field, it's
That
us.
yeah.
So if
Oh,
you see another black person doing well and you're like, you need to check yourself.
work on that jealousy, like, cause it's
Check
in there.
yourself.
Check it.
When you
Yeah,
walk into the space and you're like, nobody's going to like me, check
check
yourself.
yourself.
And the reason that's important is because you were talking about being feeling small and beaten down. And what I want people to understand is this: I'm not saying that I haven't been in positions where I have been treated like I should be the victim. It is very rare in my life, despite all the things that have gone on. The Asha thing was just like, I got stories, girl. I got stories that are inappropriate in ways where people need to get fired that I'm
Mm,
not going to tell today. Um, But I should really think of myself as a victim. I do know I'm a target, but I'm not a victim. If we all need to do a particular task or series of tasks to get to a finish line of some sort, like we all have to take a certain number of courses at a certain a percentage of accuracy to get this degree. Let's say it's the equivalent of running 100 miles. We've all run the 100 miles, but what's the difference? Many of us who are Black ran it with an extra 5-pound weight on our ankles, right? What does that make us? It makes us fitter.
Mm-hmm.
It means that we have the capacity to do more because we have to do everything they did, plus deal with bullshit. That makes us fitter. That means we're more discerning of people and their energy and what they're really about. That's a skill Black people have in spades for survival. We're not shocked when things don't go our way, like, what? But I'm me. I showed up. It should be that way, but it's not. Every single thing we do to overcome is a skill for building something for ourselves, not fitting into a place that we don't belong in. We don't belong in spaces that don't know how to appreciate our talent. We stay in those spaces to the extent that we build the necessary skill that we need until we jump ship with a plan. And by ship, I was being both literal and figurative, because you know exactly what I mean, right? So when I say that, I'm saying you need to be in a space where wherever you are like, what are the skills I need to get the hell out of here and do something on my own? Oh, I don't know much about interdisciplinary coordination in this area. I'm going to learn the shit out of that. And I have this other plan in my head where I can jump, because I don't plan on trying to fit in here. Now, some people end up in institutions and organizations where they really feel like they're treated well, they're valued. That's fabulous. We want you there. But this idea that that is the goal, to fit into these corporate or medical or industrial spaces, not necessarily. Because guess what? Greenwood and Tulsa was a thriving ass place. They were completely independent, and we can be too.
I'm so happy that you brought up Greenwood because I'm sitting here in Tulsa. And
Oh, I
yes,
was just there in November and I went to the whole museum and everything. My niece lives there.
oh, really? Wow. No, we'll have to connect.
She
I just,
literally lives right there in that intersection, that major intersection.
so you probably see how Greenwood is very gentrified now because of the One
Mm-hmm.
Up baseball stadium there.
Yeah.
So that is there. I can go on about Greenwood. That's still very devastating. We're still very devastated. And so, just like how we're speaking in terms of speech pathology, to me, it's also the Black community as a whole, kind of using that victimizing crutch where it's like, look, where's our power? We have it. Look within you, find that power and do what you can. Yes, there are systems in place to keep us back, but that's when we work smarter, not harder. So,
Exactly.
and like you said, it's a skill. It's a skill that needs developed. So sometimes you do have to fall on your ass to find that skill and to realize the skill was there and you need it. But yeah, we in Greenwood, we are still working on improving the Black community in that way. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm very happy that you mentioned that, and I'm happy to be back. I do hope that, we can build the Black speech community a bit more out here. I personally only know 2.
Mm.
So sad. I personally only know 2 Black speech pathologists out here, and one of them's in grad school. So,
Mm-hmm.
I am hoping that that changes.
Well, it's not ironic that the same year that our field was officials, I think the same year that the riots happened, and in the wake of it. So there we had an example of a group of people where, if there were speech pathologists, they would have been part of that professional community, helping the young and elderly people of their community to communicate and feed. At the time, there wasn't feeding in that world better. I also wanted to say something. When I said feeding, I just remembered. Do you know that the very first person who got slack for sex and swallowing was Jerry Logeman?
Who's Jerry Logan?
Oh my God.
I know.
Jerry Mo Logeman is the mother of swallowing. She's the one who ushered it into our field. She's the one who fought that speech pathologists should be in swallowing. And she was president of ASHA twice. And when she tried to get it in speech pathology, people initially didn't want it there for a couple of reasons, but also people would think that we deal with sex. And this was in the 90s, 80s, actually, in the 80s.
Wow, because it would be to me, it would be the '80s where they were more welcoming of that subject, no?
No, why would they be more welcoming of sex in the 80s?
I mean, you know what? And I'm definitely showing my age. But to me, I don't know, I think about, like, between the '60s and the '80s, I feel like there's a whole sex liberation movement and
Well, that
everything.
liberation had more to do with that women shouldn't have to wear certain like things, and the 50s were a much more restrictive time for women. And
Right.
there was also the Vietnam War, and people were just really rebelling in a very general way, right? And using drugs openly and trying to have peace, etc. So yes, there was a sexual liberation, but that was much more of a big white movement. Just like the women's movement was much more white than it was anything else. Black people were still and continue to be much more conservative when it comes to sex and sexuality. There was a very strong church, Baptist church sort of vibe that was happening. And so that conservatism, also they didn't have the capacity to be all free like that. It was hard enough being right down the middle in black. You know what I'm saying? You're going to put on a bikini and run through the streets. You were not seeing us do those things,
Yeah.
right? Also taking drugs with white people in the 60s in the woods. I just feel like that's your ass. Like it's a Get Out scene. You know what I'm saying? Like, what are we doing? Like that. You never see those in the documentaries, like the one brown person. I'm like, did you not know where you were in the 60s? I mean, that was pre Jim Crow. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah. Yeah, I actually know that we did have, and you might know the name of it. It was like a Woodstock, but it wasn't Woodstock. There's a whole documentary
oh,
about
yes, yes, yes. Starts with a C in New York. Oh,
crap. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm gonna have to do some
Questlove
research.
got an award for that. It was a beautiful documentary.
I know, and I hope it's still on
It's not
Netflix.
coming to me right now, but yeah, it was beautiful.
Yes, if you can think of the name, please let me know.
I
Please
will.
let me know, and also if you can let me know the article that you mentioned that you published in 2018
Yeah,
about men in the field. Yes, thank you.
it's
Well, I
actually it's actually on my webpage, so I'm happy to do that.
oh, yes, please, because I'll go ahead and link that for everyone, and I'd also like to look at it too.
So
Um,
you're talking about the movie was Summer of Soul, but it's the Harlem
Summer of Soul.
Cultural Festival in
Yeah,
1969.
okay, Summer of Soul.
That's the
Yeah.
movie, yeah.
Yes, and I think it's still on Netflix. But yeah, I really do recommend that everyone watches that. I think we always think about Woodstock, but I just remember being so amazed by that documentary. So we need to have more of those.
Hmm. Speaking of
Well,
documentaries, I actually filmed one about one in the beginning of this year called The People versus Pleasure. And it's about how institutions keep us from giving the patients that we work with what they want. I've centered it a little bit more in feeding and swallowing, but I interviewed past patients I've worked with, caregivers, SLPs, and talked about how dysphagia management might be different if we weren't so adherent to universities. So that should be out this year too. So Step now has a documentary. It's professionally filmed and everything. And also one last note before you leave is that were you at Black SLP Magic?
no,
Okay.
I was out of the country. Yep, I
That's
really did think
okay.
that.
I was
Mhm.
just saying that interesting thing is that sometimes people try to kick you out of spaces you belong in, because I mentioned before that she's now my best friend, by the time she wasn't, Reba has a company called Sexpert Consultants. And there's a show that's on Oprah Winfrey Network called Love and Marriage. And there's a filming in DC of various couples. And they contacted her to see if she would be willing to counsel one of the couples, and she wasn't available. So she asked me to do it, and I filmed it in November. And the first scenes that I'm in are supposed to air in the next 2 weeks. So I'll be on a own network show talking about sex and sexuality with a couple, and referring to myself as a swallowologist.
Loud and proud on the OWN
Yes,
network.
that's right.
Congratulations. Congratulations. Yes. Well,
Absolutely.
tell us, please, where we can find you. And before we even get into that, what is next for you? It seems like you're doing great. You're going into the film industry. I mean, what is next?
I think more of what's going on there. Like, I'm really sort of moving in. I'm excited about this documentary that's coming out. Step is doing in-person meetings, and I'll probably be doing some appearances on things on TV, documentaries, etc. So look for some of that in 2023. And you can find me at my website. If you look at my name, it's Ianessa Humpert. That's an I, not an L. Ianessahumpert.com. And that's also my IG handle and my Facebook name as well. If you want to find Gulp, you can find it in my bio information, but also it's gulp.group for Instagram, and the website is gulpgroup.com. We also have a lot of professionally filmed videos on YouTube. If you look for Gulp Group, that you should find it there.
Thank you so much for meeting with us. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and
As did
just
I.
learned so much from you, learned so much from you today. So I do hope to have you on here again. And I'm going to go ahead and end this recording. But thank you all for who's listening.